steadfastcigars.com.
livingheritageHomeschool.com.
Joined by my colleague, my friend, my longtime confidant, Tim Bushong. Tim, how are you, brother?
I am well. Thanks for setting this up, Josh. I'm glad to be here.
This should be a good one today. Tim, you're hailing from obviously the Shire. How are things in the Shire?
Yeah, the Shire is wonderful. I haven't talked to Brandon in the last couple of weeks, but he's a fellow Hobbit.
Yeah,
And but we've both come back from long journeys where we're bigger than everyone else, and we're trying to scour something, right?
we're gonna derail this whole conversation going down the Shire. No,
That's right.
You guys are dug in God's country in North Indiana. I'm in a little borough outside of Pittsburgh, and we're all trying to labor in the fields God's given
Amen.
us.
That's good. Yeah.
But tumultuous week, interesting week.
Wow.
Interesting week in many sad things happening, and
Yeah.
week. It's been a month at this point, right? Like there's been several weeks of it. Many horrible things happening, many glorious things happening, and quite honestly, some things that I would not have called. I think that some of us who would claim to a post-millennial optimism would still fight a kind of a natural inclination toward pessimism or skepticism. If I've thrown enough isms in there. But yeah, there's been some things just that I would not have called that have come through, and we might get a chance to talk about that. But Tim, you and I were coming together to chat, and I want to show everybody this article, and I'm probably going to wind up washing you out of this picture because I'm technically inept. But let me try.
You don't need my face here.
Well, yeah, we'll do the best we can. Let me at least show this. Okay, so this should be showing the article. Yep, I think it's showing on my screen. So this is one that came out through TGC. TGC is one of those publications that is, we could at least say, hit or miss. The Carson Center, I'm still waiting to kind of see how they go, but thus far it hasn't been just abundantly encouraging. But in any case, they've got this article come out. I don't mean all that to sound overly negative, but let's just say like we're waiting to see how these things go, right? This article came out, and the article is Whatever Happened to Postmillennialism, which is pretty recent. As of the date of this recording, this is 3 days in, and we're sort of doing a reaction video to this. It's written by a guy named Jonathan Baddley. Now, I don't know Jonathan Baddley. Jonathan Baddley is, though, he's a PhD candidate at University of Cambridge. He's also senior director at the London Lyceum, which, Tim, you and I have both interacted with and know guys over at the London Lyceum. So that was interesting. He's also a guy from Western Michigan, which, having hailed from Michigan quite recently, it depends on which team he roots for, but I want to like this guy.
Well, if he's from South Haven, then, let's just turn out the lights. Let's go home.
I feel like if he was from South Haven, he would have said he was from South Haven as opposed to Western PA, but we'll see. In any case,
Western PA. I thought it was Michigan.
I mean, excuse me, Western Michigan. I'm in Western PA.
That's right. That's right.
Freud was right. There was a slip right there. But how about this? At the front end, just to Jonathan, if he happens to see our humble little video or anything like that, we're open to interaction on this sort of thing. So our effort here is not to critique him nor to be mean about it. We do want to interact with his article and critique it a little bit. But just consider this an open invitation. If he happens to come across our video somehow and would like to talk, Jonathan, just know from us, much respect, and we appreciated the article and you venturing in and doing this work, and open invitation if you'd like to come on Eschatology Matters. We always want to have an open hand with those sort of things. But we also want to have the opportunity to interact critically with material, right? So that's kind of the aim today. But in general, this article was kind of an overview of postmillennialism. I don't know that this is part of a series. I took it as a standalone, but maybe it's part of a series they're doing at the Carson Center. But in any case, he kind of lays out this overview. And Tim, I don't know if you had any like introductory thoughts on that before we kind of start going into the text proper.
Yeah, as a generic overview of what postmillennialism is, as in regards to the other two eschatological positions, it's not bad. It's not like he's saying things that are just historically inaccurate or whatever.
And we can point out our biases, right?
Absolutely.
Tim and I are both coming from a post-millennial perspective. I think there'd probably be some nuances between Tim and I's views, but still, like we would both kind of see ourselves within that label. And so let's just put the cards on the table. There may be a little bit of personal defensive-ness that comes up when somebody's view is addressed. But I think Tim's right, though. Anybody that's read, for example, a systematic theology textbook, you can understand even the best scholars when they make presentations of millennial views, there's almost always something to critique in those. So we can have a little bit of
Yeah,
security on that.
exactly. He begins the article with the quote from Charles Spurgeon, "Only fools and madmen are positive in their interpretation of the apocalypse." Okay, so that's a pretty pointed statement. Uh, Positive in their interpretation of the book of Revelation. He's speaking specifically of that book.
Right.
And Josh, as you recall, in the very first Eschatology Matters conference back in, man, 3 years ago now, um, I was there representing the postmillennial perspective. And of all the speakers, I think maybe Stephen Baker accepted, I'm the only one that didn't begin their presentation with the book of Revelation.
Hmm.
I was thinking more in terms of, well, there's 66 books in the Bible, and as you've said so many times, we want to be whole Bible Christians. And my bias is obviously, I believe that the Great Commission was actually in Genesis 1, go and subdue the earth, and then the redo, the version that's really going to stick this time is Matthew 28. It's the Great Commission 2.0, go disciple all the nations. So the one mention of the word millennium in the one chapter of the one book that is really subject to quite a wide interpretive grid sometimes. That's not where I begin my view of eschatology and how these things are going to play out anyway.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things that's always interesting. Which again, this isn't to be overly critical of the article, but it does set the tone, right? This is the introductory
Yeah.
paragraph, and we start with Revelation. When I did my dissertation research, and when I've done some subsequent articles that kind of built off that, and of course the monograph I was able to write that built off that, yeah, that it starts in the Gospels. It starts in
Hmm.
Christ's, especially in Christ's illustrations and his analogies and his parables of what the kingdom is to look like, right? Like Matthew
Exactly. Yeah.
13 is there's a reason many of us would go to that and say, here's a walkthrough of Christ himself saying what the kingdom is going to look like. Look no further, start here, and then see how it's played out with the rest. So, yeah,
Right.
it's a little myopic, I think, to start with the book of the Revelation. But he does give it a definition. Well, he says, there's been a bumpy history of postmillennialism. Yeah, I mean,
You're
you
in
can
for a bumpy night.
it's going to be, yeah, bumpy, yeah, for sure. But he describes it as the belief, and I'm quoting here, the belief that Christ will return after a millennial (parentheses 1,000 year end parentheses) period of gospel expansion, mass conversion, and human flourishing. I think I would agree with him. I think
Yeah.
most of those within postmillennialism would say yes. I think the first two are a little bit easier than the third. So gospel expansion, most definitely. Mass
Hmm.
conversion, undoubtedly. Human flourishing. I think that's where a little bit, even here in the introductory paragraph, I just have some questions about that. Human flourishing has been a term that's been co-opted by many on the left.
Oh
Human
boy.
flourishing is something that's
Yeah.
not relegated to Christian circles. There's many who have no claim to Christianity that use that term in ways that are not acceptable to Christians. So I
Right.
think using that term is a little tricky. Again, that not to be overly critical, but human flourishing, I would say yes, but I would love to talk about and define what we mean as Christians with that postmillennial hope when we say human flourishing, because it's probably quite a bit different than some on the other side of certain aisles. But thoughts on that
Sure.
one, Tim?
All of human flourishing is going to be uh, in regards to God's blessing. And the
Right.
Bible defends what God's blessing looks like. Blessed is the man who does not walk with a bunch of sinners. Proverbs 1, he's not the fool who goes along with the crowd and say, "Hey, let's lie in wait for this man and take his life and we'll get all his stuff." You know, Blessing is the long-term fruit of righteousness. And so, even and one other thing in this introductory, there are those postmillennialists like myself who don't believe that it's a literal 1,000 years. It's a term, a phrase that's used to describe a long period of time. Christ returns after this long period of time that I believe, and I think you believe as well,
Hmm.
at his ascension.
Yeah.
Peter says this is that. We're all familiar with this stuff. That's when we're in the kingdom now. And it's funny, at this wedding I did last weekend, I officiated, ran into another Reformed Baptist, and he goes, I'm a really, really optimistic amillennial. And I thought, "Oh, okay, I'm going to allow it. This the Simpsons judge. I'll
Oh
allow it.
wow.
Uh, you know,
Yeah.
I'm like, and then he asked me, what's the next question? Well, where are you at with theonomy? Okay, I think I know where this guy's coming from. He's thinking, okay, do we look at society as completely outside of the extent of the rule of the kingdom? Because sometimes those our friends on the amillennial side will say, well, the church is the kingdom because that's the sphere of spirituality. And so I was pretty sure that we could enjoy hanging out and not getting any trouble. Um, but yeah, flourishing has got it's always defined by the God who made us,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah, no, it's good. Um, Getting into the kind of history that he lays out. So
Hmm.
one of the major headings he starts off with, and Tim, feel free to like if you've got something that I'm skipping past, just stop me, and we'll touch
You
on
go
it.
into the rise and decline.
I am going to the rise and decline. So he
Yeah.
starts off with the postmillennial problem, and then he talks about the rise and decline. And I think one of the issues I have, and this has been something that's come up quite frequently recently, in fact, is how he sets apart just terms. Um, I am becoming a little bit more outspoken in the fact that I do not think that our terms help us a lot of times. I understand our proclivity toward terms. I understand the desire, for example, of those within amillennial camps to say we want to be optimistic amillennials, not to be confused with radical two kingdom or escondido amillennials and all these things.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, right.
understand. Um, many of our shared friends, Tim, they have the Twitter handle where everything in their bio is a descriptor. I'm a postmillennial, blah, 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 ist, like I'm within these
18
camps.
labels later, you're
Right.
like,
And
wow,
I,
there's no question of where this man stands.
that's right. Yeah. And I understand, right? You and I are both within certain circles where we do want to make very
Yeah.
clear. I'm not standing
Yeah.
over there. I'm actually standing over here, and that's important to me. So no quabbles there. I do feel that within eschatology, this is a wound to our hamstring we frequently come across. I don't know that the labels help quite frequently. I'm becoming more convinced of this, and I think it bears out of the article. He starts by talking about sort of three major views within eschatology, and he lays out premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism.
Yeah.
That is whether people understand it or not. That is sort of like when you read a translation of certain passages within Greek or Hebrew from the Bible. If you study those translation histories and you pay attention to the way that these committees will go through these translation choices, frequently those
Yep.
are interpretive choices. They're
Yep.
interpreting what they believe the text is getting at. It's not just a one-to-one. It's not like you plug in this thing and plug it over here. Translation's a bit more messy, and they're interpreting as best as they can what they think is faithful to the original text. What I'm going to suggest here is the same works in history in many regards, and what he's applying here is an interpretation of history. It's one I disagree with, but it is his interpretation of history that there's these three camps. Now, typically, you'll see either two or four camps listed out. I would prefer the two camp view that there's postmillennialism and there's premillennialism. There's the camp that Christ returns, or the view, we could say, that Christ returns post after the millennium. There's another
Right.
camp that says he returns before a millennial reign. And then there's a lot of variance within those two views. But what he
Right.
has done instead is set up amillennialism and postmillennialism as two sort of foundationally differing views. And I don't think that's supported by where this goes with that historical overview. But thoughts
I
on that, Tim?
agree. Yeah, I thought so. So back up a little bit. Um, yeah, in his introduction, he says this about what he's about to write. It provides an opportunity to reflect on how personal and historical circumstances can subtly influence our understanding of what Scripture says about the consummation of redemptive history. Again, if we grant that, but at the same time, we're not going to say, well, since this is my circumstance, then I'm going to stay here. Um, no, what we're trying to do is, again, like all other good theologians, we want to know what the Bible specifically teaches, and at the same time say, okay, it's I could be wrong about my personal interpretation, but I'm going to try to look very broadly at all the different things. And when you're already in the middle of interpreting the historical events, I think it's going to be a little more difficult to be at least historically objective, and then exegetically objective about what certain passages teach. That's why this article doesn't really get into any exegesis or any specific passages, saying, well, here's the problem, and I think it's on postmillennialism's side more than these other two. And what you said about, really radically bifurcating amill and postmill, that's a relatively recent phenomena.
It is.
That's
It
that's
is.
that's only about 100 years old, maybe a
And
little
well, and
longer.
that's why I'm kind of quibbling with it because there's no perfect way to tell eschatology's story, right? So he's kind of come
Yeah.
at this, at least framing this as sort of a historical walkthrough, which is perfectly fine. You could do it culturally or sociologically or exegetically. There's different ways to walk through this. He started this off as a historical discussion. That's why we're kind of quibbling with a little bit of the way the history is set up, because again, amillennialism and postmillennialism wouldn't have been termed those things prior to, let's say, 150, 200 years,
At least,
conservatively,
yeah, that's
right?
being really
Yeah, you're
nice.
talking
Yeah.
late 1800s, early 1900s. You start to see these things kind of diverge. Now, the way he's laid it out here in the article, though, he speaks about postmillennialism becoming influential in the 19th century and sort of coming to rise. Um,
Uh-huh.
that's a historical interpretation, and it seems to sort of indicate that amillennialism was the stream, and then postmillennialism came out of it. What I would argue strongly is that it would have been called postmillennialism. You see this
That's
within the
right.
16th, 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries. It was called
Yep.
postmillennialism. However, there became a point at which, and a lot of this has to do with the old Princeton crowd. We've talked about them at great length, right? Like
Uh-huh.
you've got the Hodges and the Warfields and all of those, and they said, look, these things are diverging enough that let's call it different things. And then you see amillennialism and postmillennialism differentiated. I don't think their intent was to bifurcate them, but that's a story for another day. But in any
Yeah,
case,
yeah.
you see them then differentiated. So I think it's at least historically confusing to seem to imply that postmillennialism was something that emerged from amillennialism or was always distinct from it, because that's just simply not the way those terms were used.
Right. Right. Even when I read um old old premillennial theologians, say John Gill, the Baptist theologian, uh, a lot of what comes out of his pen, commenting on certain passages, especially in the New Testament, you would swear that he was millennially minded, even though he was himself committed to the premillennial system. And I think that just goes to show, uh, where your emphases lie. Like, what am I going to, like you said, we would say Matthew 13 is a pretty good indicator of what Jesus taught about the kingdom. And we're talking about the kingdom. What is that going to look like? And so we would emphasize that. Whereas when Gill would talk, say about the, oh my goodness, all the different, the progress of the gospel, he was almost right smack dab with the rest of the Puritans, looking at this, conversion of the world, coming before Christ returns.
Right.
It's amazing to me.
Yeah. I want to look, and again, stop me if I'm jumping ahead of you here, Tim, but I want to look
Yeah.
at this one little paragraph. It's right before the rise and decline. I'm going to try to share screen again, which, by the way, just for our viewers, I'm not trying to. Oh, hey, there you go. Tim's got the
That's
printout.
so helpful.
I'll throw it on here just in
Yeah,
case.
do it,
Your
man.
printout was sufficient. I'll throw it on here just in case. So if you look right here, so this is in the postmillennialism problem section, and
Mhm.
right before the rise and decline section, he's got this little paragraph that I have thoughts about this. He said certain eschatological optimism sets postmillennialism apart from both amillennialism and premillennialism, and I think most people would readily accept that. That's why we've had sort of a rise with a self-stated view of optimistic amillennialism. So good and fine. He continues, because it anticipates postmillennialism, an upward arc of gospel progress and temporal prosperity before Christ's return, and its popularity has often ebbed and flowed in step with world events. This is where I think we're going to have a little bit of
Yeah,
a friendly disagreement, a respectful disagreement. He
yeah,
continues, but this phenomenon isn't unique to postmillennialism. The trajectories of all eschatological views have reflected, to one degree or another, the course of history. Still, postmillennialism's positive outlook makes the imprint of historical influence especially visible. This is the part that I thought was going to be really interesting to talk about. So
I agree.
I appreciate what he's laying out is that you can, in many regards, see historical ebbs and flows as something that impacts Christians in a variety of views, right? You could look at, for example, the revivalist movements. You could look at the first Great Awakening or the so-called Second Great Awakening. You can sort of
Yeah.
see cultural flows, historical ebbs and flows, these sort of sea change events in our world that do have an impact on the way people at least articulate their faith, if not think about their faith and some of the positions that they take. However, and let me keep giving qualifiers. One more qualifier. He is also charitable to point out this is not something he's saying is unique to postmillennialism. He's saying I think what he's saying is I think postmillennialism is particularly open to this sort of influence, and yet it's not unique to
Right.
postmillennialism, which again is taken in good faith.
Because of our positive outlook, we're
I,
especially
I
uh,
think that's what he's aiming at, right?
well,
Is
that was
because of its
the last sentence.
right.
And I would because it anticipates upward arc. I was thinking about this today on my walk. I was like, it's almost like a corollary to personal sanctification. All of us would like to look at the graph of our life as this one steady stream. Look at that. He was conformed to the image of Christ evenly across all things. That's not how it works. That's not real life. The general direction is this way, but there is a lot of ebb and flow, right? But just because we're looking at this, I don't think that's any reason to say, we're susceptible to the ebbs and flows of history. In fact, I think we can make a pretty compelling case that most of the time, since we're time-bound creatures, and when some kind of disaster befalls, and this is one of my quibbles with the whole article. I won't get ahead though. But just when something bad happens, think of how many, and you mentioned it earlier before we even started. Um, it's not that we look at history going, getting better and better and say, well, that must mean postmillennialism true. In fact, it's quite the opposite
Hmm.
because of God has set us in time. We live in 3D space, and this is the time we've occupied, and God's ordained it from the beginning so that we would reach out and seek Him and find Him. Um, we tend to be pretty quick and reactionary with our pessimism.
Yeah.
And I remember John Warwick Montgomery years ago, man, cassette tape days, um, saying that, well, of course, no one believes postmillennialism anymore. You remember we had two world wars. Okay, well, they settles it. Dude, we're talking about a relatively small period of time in world history,
Yeah.
you know? So
I
I
also
don't,
think so. Let me piggyback on that because
yeah,
this
dude.
part is interesting and it's out of my normal wheelhouse. I would like to, and I think Tim, you're kind of like me in this regard. I would prefer to just talk about textual or exegetical arguments. I want to say why I believe this from Scripture, but he's
Yeah,
bringing up an interesting sort of historical argument. Um, we live in right now, so evangelicals, especially in the West, live in, they refer to this time period as the long peace. We've been away from wars and conflicts for an abnormal, like historically abnormal amount of time.
right.
My house has not been burnt down in my lifetime. That's extraordinary in world history. We're able to worship on Sundays, even with all the nonsense during the COVID years. We're still able to
Hmm.
worship on Sundays without any real fear or regard for that. So we live in this very prosperous time. I'm going to live longer than my great grandparents did. All things considered, God numbers our days,
Right,
and yet we're
right.
living longer. We're seeing more things, and yet we live in one of the most eschatologically pessimistic times of human history.
Yeah.
Christians are they're not bullish on what things are going to look like, and a great many Christians are looking around saying it's all gotta burn, it's gonna burn, and it's gotta burn, and it's probably going to happen by Tuesday. So that's interesting because it doesn't match this paradigm that's suggested in the article that it's just related to these historical ebbs and flows. When you look to the
Right.
Puritans, for example, I think one of the compelling things with Puritans is was there a sense of optimism with a new and undiscovered I mean undiscovered
Yeah.
all things aside, right? They have this new land they're going to. They have religious freedoms that they're looking forward to that were not previously experienced. There is much on the horizon they are optimistic about, and yet they sail across with 12 children within the first three
Man.
years. 11 of their 12 are dead. Their wife is dead by 30. They're looking to probably get to 50 or 60 if they're lucky, and they're working in a
Yeah.
hard field that will not produce soil, and they're running from attacks. Like there's optimism, but this is not a time of just peace and prosperity. This was not some
Right.
sort of golden age people fell into and thought the kingdom had come. Now you read the Puritans, and they have a strong hope. You know, the Ian
Murray.
Murray's book, right? Yeah, the
Yeah. Yeah. The
Puritan
Puritan
hope.
Hope. Great
Um,
book.
undeniable that they had this hope. I don't think it was born, and I think this is a caricature, and it's not one I'm laying at the feet of our author, of Jonathan Baddley. I think this is a caricature that I've read in many other works that do the sort of summary viewpoint of postmillennialism. There's a frequent caricature. I remember reading it in the MDiv program way back in seminary. And they said, look, it's just something that the Puritans were very excited about because there was so much prosperity. And then you read the Puritans and you compare it to their lives and you think something else seems to be going on here.
Yeah.
Their
Yeah.
unbridled just enthusiasm and optimism does not seem to match the funerals they had to attend the same year they wrote that
Oh
thing.
boy. You
And I
know,
think it's worth noting.
they knew their Bibles, and if you know your Bible, it's constantly speaking of a time in the future where not only do people live longer, but your crops grow, your cows give birth to lots of calves, they're not lost in the wintertime. And instead of having these, I would say with like my own experience, I would automatically put dispensationalist lenses on before I would read those passages. They were reading them as, okay, this is when Jesus came, this is when this was inaugurated, and someday we don't live in it now. It could be, 1,000 years from now. We have no idea. But they actually believed that stuff and took it to heart in the face of really tough situations and hardships and being attacked by, the Indians that lived where they were, and then being harried. They knew if they went back to England, they would probably go to the gallows because of their religious convictions.
Right.
There was no question about it. It's like, well, this is where we're going to have to make it go. But underpinning all of that was this firm foundation of biblical optimism, not
Yeah.
situational optimism.
Yep. And I think that's the thing is that for so many of us, it's so hard. It's so hard right now for Tim and I to not jump straight into Christ talking to a soon to be beleaguered group of disciples. They're small even when he's talking to them in Matthew 13. They're about to be smaller and more, or maybe not smaller, but beleaguered and more
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
going through more persecutions. And he says, look, there's this kingdom and you're part of it and it's going to grow. And in fact, let me tell you, it's going to grow kind of like a little bit of leaven in a lump, and it's going to actually permeate that lump. And he's giving them this
yep,
encouragement on which postmillennials have historically based their convictions. And he's telling this to a group that is not going to see that look like that in their lifetime. Even with all the glory of, Acts chapter
right,
2, there's
right.
the grandeur of Acts 15, the count, like there's great things, and yet they are tiny. We would
Oh,
think insignificant, but they're
right.
hanging it on Christ's words. And I think that's something that like just for those of us as exegetes, and for all I know, this may be the case for our author that we're interacting with. It's difficult not to want to go to those portions of this story. But let me look at this one thing with you, Tim.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull up the screen real quick. Although your printout again was more than sufficient. It was good. Um,
Move it around.
yeah, yeah. We got rise and decline. This is one of the larger sections. And again, I want to make sure that I give our author credit. He gives some very good. So number one, he talks about Augustine's figurative reading of Revelation 20. I don't think that that's something that I would pin on amillennialism. I think that many of us, including myself within postmillennial thought, have keyed off of a more figurative reading, and yet we'll leave that as it is.
Yeah.
But he speaks in this section about how it's hard to sort of distinctly map millennial views onto some of these authors. I really appreciated this part of the article because especially if you've read Augustine, everyone claims Augustine. Not only
Yeah.
not only amillennials
Yeah.
and postmillennials, but Protestants and Roman Catholics,
That's
everybody
right.
claims Augustine, right? So it's one of those
Yep.
things where some of these authors that we look to were not as distinct in their thinking, and they certainly weren't thinking of my camp versus this other camp that's going to come into emergence 400 years down the road. So makes that a little
Sure.
difficult. I appreciated him walking through that. He does mention some of the debates around, and he mentions Ian Murray and some of the debates around Romans 9 through 11 and what that sort of consummation might look like. This is the portion I believe right here in the section that I'm looking at. I hope they could see me highlighting where he's talking about some of the Puritans and how it's hard to map. But this is where I think we might have some maybe disagreement. So he talks about how the hope of the Puritans sort of failed to coalesce. Puritanism's, as he frames it, Puritanism's failure to secure a lasting foothold in the Church of England in 1662, and those convictions kind of going on until the 18th century. He speaks of
Hmm.
Jonathan Edwards in the First and Second Great Awakenings. This is a prime example. Well, let me finish, and then I want to come back to this little point. And then he talks about Enlightenment ideas of progress and how, in his words, the seeds that sowed postmillennial thought were also the seeds of its demise. And then he gets into things like German higher criticism and a lot of the things that came along with the tumult of the 19th century. Let me start right back here, though. When he talks about, for example, Jonathan Edwards and the First and Second Great Awakenings, I think that's a fair example of how these things don't neatly map onto history either. So when you look at the First Great Awakening, there's a lot to celebrate. When you look to the Second Great Awakening, you see a promulgation of heresy that we are still trying to dig ourselves out from under hundreds of
Yep.
years down the road. I
Yep.
don't think that was something that all of the leaders at the time had his rose-colored glasses on, as that may give the impression of. I don't think that was a
Yeah.
post-millennial hope, in other words. But thoughts on this section, Tim?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, if you think about the time period that Jonathan Edwards lived through, his struggles with the church, the halfway covenant, having to deal with recalcitrant church members and old Puritans. We've been here longer than you, young man. Um, and then the First Great Awakening. You're right. That was a marked revival God sent. Second grade, in fact, last week I just spent a half hour talking with two people who represent early 19th century heresies. And I'm like, well, it's almost atypical of you guys to think you can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's not really, I think that's just human hubris and arrogance. Um, but when privately, he paid close attention to current events, ready to slot them into a chronological framework derived from his reading. I'm not sure about that. Are you? I mean, it seems like I haven't read enough Edwards myself personally to know, but it doesn't sound like what Edwards was doing when he was talking about uh, the kingdom of God and writing about it and things of that nature. It could be. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. Um, but no, the I never saw historically when I was studying both of those. And have you ever read Ian Murray's Revivals and Revivalism?
I've read portions, but not the whole thing. But yes.
Yeah, that's a great book. I should own it.
Mhm.
I borrowed it years ago. Um, but I don't think that your view of things getting upward and onward and better was really a catalyst for at least the Second Great Awakening. God's law and repentance and your own standing before Him, definitely in the first one. Um, I like you say, that is a historical interpretation. There's so much more that was involved in the Second Great Awakening that now we look back on it and it's marked by lots of excess, lots of heresy, um, people reading the Bible in an arrogant, oh, no one's ever looked at it before, as if um, that was a good thing.
Yeah. I think with the history part, and yeah, I'd probably have to cede way to an Edwards scholar. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, maybe we could look at that. But I mean, he does note, looking to our author here, he does note, for example, the rise of dispensationalism being a factor in this kind of cultural zeitgeist. Again,
Hmm.
I think one of the dangers here is that it can tend, and I'm not saying this is the author's intent, but it can tend to the reader to sound like Christians are arriving at their convictions purely based on socio-historical cultural
Right,
winds and waves
right.
and I doubt the author would say that, right? But like just these sort of articles, that's always something I think is a little bit of a little warning label that should be on there, is that there's still Christians that are being convicted, hopefully the majority, that are actually being convicted from the text in these things. But be that as it may, he does mention the rise of dispensationalism. I think that that's apt. I think that that was a good point to point out.
Yeah.
No doubt he will catch flack from our dispensational brethren for pointing out the 19th century. I think Tim and I have no problem with his dating on that, so fine by me. But this is something that
Right.
sharply contrasts with postmillennialism. I think you could at least say this sentence without catching flack, is that the dispensational eschatology of the 19th century was anything but optimistic. I think that that's a pretty safe statement, right?
I think it's pretty
Um,
good. You know, the old why polish the brass on a sinking ship? You
that's
know,
it.
there's
That's it.
some of the statements that came out of it, especially the early 20th century. And the thing is, you know, here in northern Indiana in the Shire, it was the de facto, because I was born in 60. I saw it, you know, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s. It was the de facto position. In fact, your commitment to the inerrancy of the Bible could be gauged from your dispensationalism or lack thereof.
Oh yeah.
And just 20 minutes from my house, Grace Theological Seminary, Alva J. McLean wrote in their statement of faith, you had to sign that you believed in premillennial, pre-wrath. I think it goes that far. And if you didn't, then you might not be able to get a job there because you obviously don't believe your Bible,
You're right.
you
Yep.
know?
So
So yeah, there's no
pushing
question.
pushing in a little more, there's two things I think he misses. Now, one of the rules of writing and one of the rules of academic publishing and or just reading charitably is you can't really fault somebody for what they didn't say, because none of us can
Yeah.
say everything. I
Yep.
get that. This isn't offered as a critique of what he didn't say, because again, he said things that he said. However, I think two things that would be very helpful in an article like this. Number one would be to look at the modernist versus fundamentalist controversies that were occurring during this time. So when you look at modernism versus fundamentalist sort of clashes, now here I'm thinking of some of the, especially when higher criticism was making its inroads, as he noted in the article. But you have sort of this tension between social reform and doctrinal purity with a great many Christians. And this isn't just something born in academia. This is something that very much birthed itself into the church and into the pew. I think
Yeah.
that would have been
Yeah.
a really helpful inclusion that would have explained things along something historical, and yet it was deeply doctrinal within the church. And it spilled out into our eschatology, I think. Now, kind of related to that, or at least maybe driving alongside of it, is the fact that within reformed circles, within any sort of historically reformed, Dutch reformed, but just broadly reformed circles, you typically see a preservation of a certain sort of eschatological outlook. You lose a great deal of that, whether you want to frame that as postmillennialism or amillennialism or a combination thereof of the both. I would say a sort of a combination, a broadly postmillennial eschatology.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
lose a lot of that influence, though, within the Western United States and the developments over the last 150 years that have seen Reformed theology become a distinct minority and a broadly evangelical belief become the vast majority. And typically, that broadly evangelical belief is at least lay level dispensational in its thinking. It's
Yeah.
certainly not statedly reformed or covenantal in its theology nor in its eschatology. Again, that's
Oh,
something
absolutely.
that would be historical, and yet it's also looking at some of those doctrinal, theological, convictional markers that occur along the way. So, two
I mean,
thoughts that I had.
yeah, when I look back, you think about the inception of the 20th century and the Azusa Street revival
Mhm.
in Southern California. Of course, we have, you know, Kansas is in the bag too. But the Assemblies of God were absolutely dispensationalist in their beliefs, and that was a huge movement then within evangelicalism. In fact, the charismatic movement, which came out of that kind of, you know, belief in the perpetuity of the sign gifts. I recall back in the late 80s when we were first walking with the Lord and we thought we were charismatics, and there was no question and about dispensational, about that framework. And as you talk about a decline in a movement, the only person I knew back then who was even remotely not pre-mill was a guy who had subsequently gone on to practice speaking in tongues or whatever that is. He had graduated from Westminster, Philadelphia. I just, I didn't even know what that was, at the time. I was just a baby. Um, but yeah, all that to say, you want to talk about the very air you breathe was that basic kind of broad. I always call it, Midwest. You've got your missionary church, all the different United First Brethren churches. They're all really similar
Yeah.
to a church, man. They're Arminian in their soteriology. They're pretty individualistic. They don't have a real high view of the church as the church. And the hymn books always started with all the revival songs. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right, let me look at this last part. There's only like two major sections that I had left. There's kind of the conclusion, this last large section, and then there's that the why this ultimately matters part. I'm going to try to share screen one more time on this. This will be my last one trying this. Hopefully it's working. I'm very good at this, Tim. I'm a professional. So
Man,
here,
slick.
so at the end of this section, he says postmillennial has made something of a comeback in the kind of mid 20th century. I think he's right about that. We on our channel, for example, have kind of celebrated and lamented the fact that postmillennialism has made a comeback because you want it to be something that's, if it's true, you want it to be catching on and people to be considering it. However, you don't want it to be trendy as if it's something that comes and goes and everybody forgets about it, like Jinko jeans or something like that.
Or young, restless, and post-millennial.
Oh, dude, so good. That's exactly it, right? He
Yeah.
he ties it to some interesting figures. So again, there's two figures that he relates this to. Number one would be R.J. Rushdoony.
Hmm.
He talks about sort of R.J. Rushdoony having a spearheading of postmillennial thought. Now, I'll be honest. If you were to have asked me what influence R.J. Rushdoony has had, I could think of a couple I'd put my finger on. I don't know that I would have put it on postmillennialism, but I'm open to your thoughts on this and us considering it because this to
Hmm.
me this is almost about a matter of opinion. So, we could probably have divergent opinions on this, and I'm not going to say he's wrong and I'm right.
Yeah,
This
right,
is an
right.
interesting one. The second one, he points out the influence of Doug Wilson and Christchurch in Idaho, and then he ties in New St. Andrews College as well. I don't think that any of us would probably debate the fact that Doug Wilson and Canon Press. I mean, if you go to Canon Press's app or their website, you can probably find an outsized influence of postmillennial thinking, and I mean they're not only are they punching above their weight grade, they're also having a lot more postmillennial representation than you'd probably find in many other spots. So I don't
Right.
necessarily debate that one, but it's just interesting. Um, I'm really thinking of Moscow, and I'm thinking of the whole Moscow influence. So, for example, when I came around to postmillennial thinking eventually, we at our channel have interacted with guys from Moscow. We've talked to Doug
Yep.
Wilson. We've talked to many of those guys.
Yep.
Have no issue doing so. And yet, my post-millennial struggle began writing my dissertation when I was in, especially in the strongman slash Beelzebul controversy passages where Christ is saying, "I came, I tied up the strong man who is Satan, and I bound him so that I
The
could plunder
exorcism
his
of
house."
Satan,
That's
right?
it, right?
That's it.
And I'm in
Yes.
that struggling, and I keep on having pushback from my readers who keep on warning me, look, be careful with the application, though. We don't want to go too far. And all I was trying to do was say, look, Jesus said he did this thing. Now, obviously,
Yeah.
Satan's not dead and gone. He's still there. He still has
Right.
influence. And yet it seems like this massive wholesale change has happened such that he can't do what he used to do. And there's going to be a change in the house. And I kept on getting some
Hmm.
pushback from these guys because they were more of the amillennial camp, strongly amillennial. And they were saying, no, 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 be very careful with that. And my question kept on coming back, like, why though? Like, this seems to be borne out from the text.
Right.
And then I get past my dissertation phase. I'm reading guys like, this is why I have such an affinity for the old Princeton crowd. I'm reading guys like Hodge and Warfield, and I'm saying, they're seeing the same things I'm seeing.
Yep.
That's not
Absolutely.
necessarily a Doug Wilson influence. And what bothers me about this is Doug Wilson, whether you love or hate him, he's a firebrand, and you're typically going to love or hate him, right? He's a very I don't want to say controversial figure. What's the word I'm looking for here? He's one of those guys that people will have a reaction to, whether strongly positive or strongly negative, quite frequently. So to
Yeah.
throw Doug Wilson in here and say this is kind of the influence of modern postmillennial thought, it runs the risk of making postmillennialism sound like it's associated with a controversial figure. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think if you were to survey the evangelical or even reformed landscape and see where guys are anchoring postmillennial thought, I don't think they're all
Yeah.
going to be pointing to Moscow. So that's just
Yeah.
an interesting one to
How
think
about we
through.
point to uh, Francis Nigel Lee? How about we point to R.C. Sproul and then point to a guy named Greg
Roll,
Bonson?
right?
Yeah, exactly.
We live
Exactly.
we live in Pittsburgh. He is the patron saint of Pittsburgh.
Yes.
This is
Yes.
Sproul, and that might shock a lot of people. Like that's where he was pointing.
Every time the Steelers lose, you hear this one voice. What's wrong with you people?
You
Yeah,
probably
exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
I was just going over some of my books on the shelf, and there's Ken Gentry, there's Gary DeMar, there's RC, the Last Days According to Jesus.
Marcellus
There's
Kick, many from the
oh
Dutch tradition.
yes,
I would argue Abraham Kuyper was postmillennial. He was just a little bit inconsistent, but still, like there's a
yeah,
lot within the Dutch Reformed
yeah,
tradition,
yeah,
especially.
absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about that too, and you can't help but read uh, Francis Nigel Lee's The Central Significance of Culture and walk away from that thinking, well, yeah, he's not post mill. My
Mm,
goodness, the whole thing is, God has given us this beautiful creation. Now repent of your sins, trust in Christ, and start digging for diamonds or whatever it is.
mm.
Start making use of all the tools that God's given you, get to work and make something beautiful. Why? Well, because there's a future coming.
Yeah,
As I said, why would a kid, spend all his time practicing layups and stuff? Well, he has his eye to the future. He believes that something better is going to come, and if he works really hard, maybe he can play basketball for a living.
yeah,
He's not pessimistic.
yeah. Nope.
I had one thought, and it's a bit of a quibble, but when he back a page. Uh, when he talked about the rise of German biblical criticism, skeptical eye over the historical veracity of the Bible, economic depression, okay. Um, where was I think I just oh yeah, challenge the biblical foundations of postmillennialism. Well, let's not stop with challenge the biblical foundations of postmillennialism. Everything back then was being co-opted, terms were being switched. You talk to anybody who was involved in the 50s bad. Now they're all dying now, but over those things where it's Walter Martin's language barrier. They'll use the same words but mean different things.
Right,
The liberals do that with everything. The higher critics would do that. The unbelievers, yes, I believe in the resurrection, as long as you define it as something other than his physical body coming out of the
right.
grave. They did it with everything. And, fatherhood of God. Yeah, we believe that God is the father. Yeah, of all men because you live in the neighborhood of Boston and you believe in the fatherhood of God, whatever nonsense that is. So I think it's maybe a little unfair to say, well, that's why postmillennialism was co-opted and turned into this, onward and upward progress. They,
And I think that's the reason I reacted, because I reacted to the same thing, and it
yeah,
wasn't just so much as what he said in the article, but it goes back to what we were discussing earlier with like I heard that trope in seminary so frequently as something unique to postmillennialism, and then the more
uh-huh,
you read, you realize this hit literally everybody in the chin. Like
everything.
everyone was taking
Yep.
it on the chops for this one, and yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
that's why they wrote a series of articles that ended up becoming known as the fundamentals.
right, yeah,
So we're going
so
to define ourselves by what the Bible teaches, and these are our lines in the sand. And so it wasn't all just postmillennialism; it was
right,
everything else.
yeah. No, that's a good point. So he wraps it up, and I appreciated the way he wrapped it up. And again, the article, I hope I'm being effusive about his article because it was well written. I felt like it was charitably presented. We had a little bit of quibbles with it, but they're presented with brotherly
Sure.
affection. He
Yep.
ends it though, and this is just something I find just a little bit funny, but also just I admire his boldness. He wraps it up with a quotation out of Matthew 24 in his concluding paragraph, well, concluding section in the second
Yeah.
paragraph, which
Yeah.
when I was reading, I thought, wow, he's going out with the punch, right? Because Matthew 24, obviously, Olivet Discourse, this is a tough one. He
Right.
goes right for
Right.
24:36, right in the middle of
Yeah.
that whole section. So I bring that up just because I found it amusing. That was a fun way to end. Like he's not backing out quietly. He actually ended with kind of a bang in
Well,
Matthew
that's, and
24.
to be honest, I would commend that too. Oftentimes if I'm entering into a debate with somebody, I'm going to take the passage that they think is the most slam dunk in favor and begin by refuting that, or at least, mentioning it in such a way that they wouldn't interpret it that way. It's kind of a rhetorical tool. It's fine. And it's funny, we just saw that Brandon put together the 3-year anniversary video, and that
Yeah.
that quote from me, there it is, Matthew 24. This is the only time this generation is used like that in the whole Bible. What a unique thing. Yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Let's go to
So
Matthew 24.
all in all, appreciated the article. I appreciate him
Yeah,
wading in. I don't know, Tim, if you got anything else on your list here, but it was one of those that I do think he misses the mark a little bit in in the way he's framing historical postmillennialism. I don't think he's outside the pale or far removed, certainly
right.
from many other takes on postmillennialism. It would just be something I think is a little bit of a mistake on that. But we've kind of walked through our disagreements. But overall, again,
Yeah, I
my
mean,
hat's always off to somebody that wades into eschatology. It's a tough subject. So
yeah, I agree, and especially like, let's say I was to write a summary article like this on premillennialism. You want to be as fair as you can, but you're obviously going to get your digs in, even if they're subtle and they're you didn't intend to hurt anyone's
well, and
feeling.
I'll mention again. So G3 Scott Annual invited me to write a contribution for an article on post mill, and so
Yeah,
they did a 4 views thing, and I was contributing for post mill. We had a word count, and I'm going to point out again. This is my third time on air pointing this out. I was the only one that actually obeyed the word count.
man. I'm
I'll put
just
that grievance aside. We're called to forgive one another in love.
I'm just saying.
I
I
tried.
did what was asked of me.
That's right. But when you lay something like that out, like number one, plenty of people who are post mill would disagree with my take on post mill. That's fine. Like there's always in-house debates. But also it's just
Sure.
really hard. It's really hard to write those things in short format, and somebody's always going to have something to push back on. So again, I say that because we do have some things we wanted to push back on, but again, we appreciated the article, and in
Yeah,
general it was an interesting read. We just have some disagreements on a little bit of
sure. Sure. I
it.
I think that the recent revival, and I'm talking about within the last maybe 10 years of people kind of going from, whether it's kind of a bog standard Midwest evangelical, pre-mill. Everyone knows that. Or maybe more in the on-mill camp. I've seen it more from pre-millennial guys going post-mill, kind of like with Brandon, frankly. Um, our good friend, our Nephilim buddy. Of course, you're up there too. You're
He's
pretty
got me
Nephilim.
beat. Anybody that's seen the two of us together thinks, wow, that's a tall guy, and wow, that's an even taller guy. Maybe the
That's an
taller guy's
even
Brandon.
taller
But
guy.
no, but
Yeah,
I appreciate what you're getting at, Tim. It doesn't so like one of the funny things about postmillennialism is it doesn't make sense with our current social moment, cultural moment. It has blossomed in the years of COVID, in the years of so
right,
many things we could
right.
mention, right? And
That's
by the way,
right.
I think people get this confused sometimes because, again, Charlie Kirk's memorial was last night. You saw
Yeah,
more more of our country's leaders, and again, don't nitpick
dude,
it. You can
dude, are
point
you
out
tired of
lots.
winning yet? This
You
is
can,
ridiculous.
yeah, and
Amazing.
but you like what I was going to encourage people to is like don't. I saw some guys like nitpicking like there was improper gospel presentations or they were painting
Yeah.
things wrong. If you've ever been to a Christian funeral, you understand people will say things wrong. That happens, right?
Yeah.
These are not pastors, many of them.
Yeah.
But like you just said, Tim, you had more of our country's leaders confessing Christ, talking about Christian forgiveness. His widow going up there and talking about Christian forgiveness. That should be an easy win for Christians.
Dude, you
However,
got
and a
you,
thing to
you,
celebrate, right? However,
yeah.
I want to just point this part out in regard to the postmillennialism thing. When that sort of thing happens, everybody, including I think our Eschatology Matters Twitter channel that Brandon oversees, gets online and they're hashtag that post mill. Are you tired of post mill yet? Here comes the kingdom. That's a joke.
Yeah,
I just want to explain this for people. That's a joke. When he does that and when other people do that, he's not actually saying because Charlie Kirk's memorial went well, postmillennialism must be true, and if it didn't
that's
happen,
right.
my postmillennial faith would falter. That's a joke, and it's just an
Yeah,
online banter thing. The hope is anchored in something that, and this is what I was saying a minute ago, that shockingly, COVID and all the things we've gone through in the last 5 years didn't shake. It actually blossomed. That's
yeah,
something that's not born on the waves and winds of cultural zeitgeist. That's something that's actually born, I think, from biblical conviction and hope. So, for what
yeah.
that's worth.
I agree, 100%. It was so um, so encouraging to see the leaders of the greatest nation on the earth, free country, America. Everyone wants to come here. Everyone wants to be us, and everyone wants to take us down. There's a reason for that. Um, I've kind of white pilled on some stuff, but when I became a post millennialist, it was during Obama's years, and things weren't looking that great because oh, my views evolved. Oh, great. There was all kinds of negativity then. And like you say, this latest spate of people coming over to this optimistic eschatology happened when, you had targets on your back. Now, forgive the metaphor,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because it's a little soon. I don't mean it that way. Um, but when you've got, and I know this is a little shift in the conversation, uh, those of us that are post mill, we realize that what happened yesterday is one of those trajectories. And when it goes back down a little bit, it's still going to be going here. Here's the goal, right? Um, but we're not going to be shaken if crazy leftists get in power again in this country. America could go the way of all flesh, and postmillennialism stands true. It's
Yeah.
the church that really matters.
Yeah.
Now, in the meantime, we have an open a window of opportunity. We've got a young man in our church who works for a national gun rights group. He's going to train some people on how to primary weak GOP candidates, all the kind of practical things that you would want to see in play. That is not what my postmillennialism is based on.
Yeah.
Mine's based on Genesis 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 110, go all through Isaiah, the vision of the kingdom, and the Gospels, and Christ being the second Adam,
Mm.
who succeeded where Adam failed and will succeed, because all authority is his. He told us to go disciple the nations, and he's with us. Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's why I'm a postmillennialist.
Yep. And in that vein, because I do know we need to wrap this one up, but in that vein, I tweeted out this morning, Psalm 72:11, may all kings fall down before him, all nations serve him. That's the
Amen.
postmillennial hope, and we believe because
Amen.
Christ said it will happen, it will indeed happen. So, Tim Bushong, the famous
Josh
Tim
Howard,
Bushong, thank you for joining me, brother. It's good to be back on here with you, man.
you too. And I just want to do a shameless self-promotion. Make sure you listen to Battle Hymns 3. I think it's some of my finest work. And there's some really encouraging music on that. And friends of mine suggested the songs. I didn't come up with the playlist myself.
Perfect.
Even that firebrand Doug Wilson suggested one of the songs. So there we go.
Battle Hymns 3. It's out, right?
The title track, Rise Again, You Lionhearted, all streaming services carrying it. Yep.
Perfect. Brandon, we'll see if he can get on there and put the links in and stuff like that. But thank you guys
Yep.
for joining us, and Tim, appreciate your time, brother.
You too, man. Blessings.
Seated here at my right hand, the